going to hear from Ananda and I'm going to quickly read his bio to you. So Ananda was born in Calcutta, West Bengal, India. Ananda is the U.S. and Canada Program Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, an international network of community-based organizations organizing against climate and community-polluting industries such as incinerators and landfills in favor of zero waste, clean energy jobs for communities. Since 1998, Ananda has worked on labor justice, environmental justice, and anti-war, trade justice, climate change, sustainable forestry, and agricultural campaigns around the world. Ananda is also an active on the board of the Energy Action Coalition, the Rising Tide North America Network, the Mobilization for Climate Justice Coalition, the Ruckus Society, the Movement Generation Trainers Network, and Climate Justice Now. Over the last couple of years, Ananda has been helping convene a national climate justice alignment process for social and environmental justice groups with the aim of building a grassroots movement for community-led climate and energy justice in the U.S. Ananda lives in the East Bay, California with his wife and son. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here to share some of our stories. Thank you, Jackie, for organizing this gathering. I wanted to use my time here to talk a bit about not just the injustices on communities of color and working class communities in North America, but really about how these same communities, I refer to them as frontline communities, are leading the fight against climate and community pollution. In fact, when we look at the last few years, these communities have been responsible for stopping a vast array, a huge amount of pollution, both climate pollution like carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, but also toxins, dioxins, and all kinds of air pollutants from being, facilities from being sited in their communities. I make that distinction because just as we think of these communities as being fence line or impacted, it's also important to recognize that they're on the front lines of the fight against this industrial pollution. They're oftentimes leading that fight. It's our job to support them, empower them as they determine is appropriate. The Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, we are a network of community-based groups and allied groups around the world. We came together 10 years ago when a number of communities found that they had common cause in fighting waste incinerators from being built in their communities. We work to stop these incinerators and other forms of incinerators, tire incinerators, biomass incinerators. I believe both Jackie and Lee mentioned a number of them, in favor of community-based solutions like zero waste. Zero waste is essentially recycling, composting, reusing materials locally so that we don't have to extract and produce and waste more materials and create those jobs locally. We work towards zero waste, environmental justice for these communities, and also labor justice, keeping jobs local, and so that huge expensive facilities aren't built which are largely employ people from outside these communities. We work with a basic set of principles, and I think this is core to a lot of the success I was talking about earlier, how these community-based groups do succeed in fighting industrial pollution. Primarily, we, as a network, we try to respect local wisdom and priorities. We're not top-down, we're very much a network, so we provide support, research, coordination, facilitation, but it's really the community leaders that determine what they want, how they want to campaign against a particular industrial facility. We are decentralized, like I mentioned earlier. We have a handful of coordinators like myself around the world in different regions, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe. We're very low on staff, but we're very rich in the diversity of our membership and in our local leadership. And that's really critical towards our success. We work on the premise that mutual aid really builds alignment. So rather than me running around trying to support the 200 community groups that are part of our North American network, I try to find deep neighbors that can help. I try to connect communities to communities where they live nearby each other, and I should say a number of the members here on the panel have been very helpful in connecting NAACP chapters and other environmental justice groups with our members over the years, and really making sure that the fights are solidified at a local and regional level. We seek community solutions. not expensive solutions. When I say community solutions, I refer to solutions that are affordable, that are accessible, that can employ local people and have long-term community resilience in mind. And ultimately, I believe a couple of people mentioned our movements are really our network is really ground up. Our leadership is local, and we seek the local wisdom and the local priority in all the decision making we do. Globally in our network, we've been working for a number of years with waste workers. Many of you are familiar with the history of the waste worker movements here in the US and how critical to a lot of the civil rights movement, the organizing of workers in the waste sector were. Internationally, there's over 20 million waste workers who sort, recycle society's discards. These are some of the poorest workers in the world. Today, many of them are organized. We have waste worker associations from Africa, Asia, Latin America that we are helping to facilitate their coming together at important conventions like the UN Climate Conference, where they can tell the leaders of the world that their services actually protect our planet and our children. And so they need to be compensated for those essential climate and environmental services, for the work they do. Here in the US, we do similar work with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, who represent about 30,000 workers in the waste sector, trying to unionize waste and recycling sector jobs and create more. I'll talk a bit about that later. Like I said, we've had some very impactful gatherings with waste workers at international summits where workers from all over the world have been able to gather and speak to the decision makers in government. Back here in the US, my work involves coordinating, like I said, about 200 members, community groups around the US and Canada who are fighting incinerator proposals with zero waste solutions. A bit about the history, some of you who were around and active back in the 80s and 90s remember there was a huge surge of incinerator proposals. Over 400 incinerators were proposed for the US alone. More than 300 of them were defeated by community groups. 100 were built predominantly in people of color communities, indigenous communities, and working class communities. Of those 100, there's 87 remaining standing today, again, largely in African American, Latino, and indigenous communities, and in poor white communities in the Deep South. And those are the communities we're trying to support today in shutting down some of those old facilities. While these old facilities remain, every week there's a whole slew of new proposals, and actually this Google map shows in the last 4 months some of the proposals that have just popped up. Incinerator companies just, when they're kicked out of one community, they move to the next one, usually seeking people of color communities where there's hasn't been much word about incineration and waste options, and where they seek out political champions amongst local decision makers. Where we've been successful is at locally organizing and raising awareness, getting neighboring communities to support them. We've been able to force a lot of the local decision makers to overrule these proposals. In the last since September, we've actually shut down, effectively stopped 19 incinerators and 2 coal power plants, and the world's largest incinerator in Detroit, which I'll mention briefly later. Incineration, as mentioned earlier, like landfill sites and a number of other toxic facilities, is a critical core environmental justice issue. Incinerators are the largest industrial source of dioxins around the world. They're a huge source of a range of heavy metals and poisons, and particulate matter. I'll make a brief mention of particulate matter because this is the one pollution, a toxin that evades the latest pollution control devices. They say here in California up to 20,000 people, deaths can be attributed to industrial particulate matter, a number of which comes from a range of different combustion facilities like incinerators. It's also worth mentioning, Dr. Bullitt was mentioned earlier. He did a study a few years ago called Toxic Waste and Race in 20, looking at, in a 20-year time frame from 1987 to 2007, what had really changed. And today, the findings of this report that today, the likelihood of a landfill site or an incinerator or another toxic waste facility being sited in a community of color, an African American or Latino community or an indigenous community, is significantly higher than it was 20 years ago. So that's what we're up against today, and that's where a lot of what we really need to do is really support these communities in establishing and demanding their rights. It's worth noting that incineration is one of the most climate polluting forms of energy. Contrary to a lot of industry greenwash. Incineration is actually more carbon intensive. That is, it produces more carbon dioxide per unit of electricity than coal. Incineration is also the most expensive form of energy. It's about the capital cost for building an incinerator about 60% higher than a nuclear power plant and about 2.5 times as costly as a coal power plant per unit of electricity. The operating costs are even higher. They're about 3 times as high as a nuclear power plant and about 10 times as high as a coal power plant. And this is what the federal and a number of state governments are trying to propose as an alternative to coal today, saying that, oh, the environmentalists have convinced us that coal is bad, let's look at incineration. This is a green alternative. And that's where we find that despite all the risk we've highlighted with these incinerators and public health and its impacts in communities and exposing all the poisons and economic downfalls, the incinerator industry has persisted and keeps coming back with new proposals. And the main reason for that is because we still subsidize them. Billions of dollars go through renewable energy subsidies of a whole range of kinds, some incentives, some subsidies, some grants, some tax credits, but a range of subsidies to prop up this infrastructure. And this is what we need to stop today, and I'll come around to that in my final ask. But basically, these are public funds that are spent on polluting people of color and working class communities around this country, depleting precious natural resources and causing climate change. And the core driver of this is the fact that our communities do not have a voice in DC, where these lobbyists, the Kavantas and the incinerator companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars convincing our leaders that this is a clean form of energy. So while in cities like Detroit, we've had massive success in bringing together the environmental justice community, labor unions, and a range of other allies from the region in shutting down some of the largest toxic facilities in the world, we've been able to do so where we've been able to cut that supply chain of funding, where the Teamsters Union supported Zero Waste Detroit in the state of Michigan to end the renewable energy credits. That's where the company could no longer afford to continue. We're facing that same thing here in California right now. The California Air Resources Board is trying to provide exemptions, air pollution exemptions, for the 3 waste incinerators, all located in people of color communities, 2 here in South LA, 1 in a farm worker community in the Central Valley. And this is a fight that's happening today, and we could use the NAACP's political power and support to force Sacramento, California Air Resources Board, to not provide those subsidies. If we stop those subsidies, those incinerators can be turned into something much more beneficial for our communities, that is zero waste jobs. If we stop burning and burying trash, we can create 10 times the number of jobs per tonnage of waste. A recent study we're about to release in the next month shows that we can create up to 1.5 million new jobs across the US. That's more jobs than we could create in the wind, solar, and hydroelectric sectors if we replaced coal power plants. We could create 1.5 million new jobs out of recycling and composting alone, and then in recycling related manufacturing, another range of jobs can be created. This is the direction we need to go. It's proven. Cities like San Francisco are already at 78% recycling. The rest of the nation can do it if we just need the political will. Moving to zero waste would also drastically reduce the pollution burden we've been talking about in our communities. There's been some studies done. We're about to release another report about the levels of dioxins, furans, carcinogens, and other endocrine disruptors and other human toxins that can be reduced. The climate pollution that could be reduced if we went to zero waste. If we recycled everything, about 92% of today's waste in the US, we could be, that would be equivalent to taking about half the cars off US roads and shutting down about a quarter of the country's coal power plants. So it's a significant amount of pollution we could reduce if we just created more jobs. It all makes sense, right? So the challenge again is the lobby, the politicians. I wanted to end with saying that, going back to the thought about frontline communities, because I think that's where, if we invest our resources, we get the biggest bang for our buck. Our leadership in our communities have been doing amazing work. We've stopped any new incinerator from being built in this country in the last 14 years. We've shut down hundreds of coal power plants. We've stopped some of the largest oil refineries from being expanded in some of these frontline communities through our networks. These communities have done this through very little staff, with mostly volunteer resources and large mobilizations at the local level, because it's in our communities where we can hold our decision makers accountable, not in DC, not in the state capitals. However, if your chapters can support our networks and we could effectively link our friends to support each other, if the NAACP nationally and at the state level can tell the state and federal governments to stop providing the subsidies, I think we can win. I think we can eventually ban all toxic combustion facilities across this country, and we've been doing this for decades, and I think we can bring that chapter to a close with your support. I would ask those of you in LA to consider supporting the local groups who are fighting the 2 incinerators. There's actually 2 more incinerators being proposed for LA right now, so we definitely need the city of LA to stop those proposals from moving through. We need to stop the subsidies in California, and we need to stop the subsidies in DC. So please join us in doing so. Thank you.